In 1919, Australian Prime Minister Billy Hughes returned from the Paris Peace Conference as a hero. Not only did he spend time with the troops in France, but he stood up to America to ensure that Australia would control Samoa and New Guinea and co-manage Nauru. A crowd of 500 soldiers greeted the little digger and hoisted him onto their shoulders. Unfortunately for Hughes though, this popularity wouldn't extend to the rest of Australia. As a nation, Australia was jaded. Not only had it been through a 4-year war that didn't directly affect their interests, but the Aussie death toll for the Spanish flu was now in its thousands. To make matters worse, as the year went on, the soldiers started to turn against him. Hughes said that he wouldn't give a 5-year tax exemption to veterans, and so going into the 1919 election at the end of the year, it seemed as though Australia's most controversial Prime Minister was about to meet his end. Okay, so today we're going to look at the downfall of Billy Hughes, but before we do that, let's get nostalgic. The year is 2006 and you have a Year 4 report due tomorrow on the First Fleet. Before you start, you have the all-important job of selecting one of these clip art fonts to go with for your title. Which one do you choose? Anyone who can correctly guess my go-to font gets a shout out next week. But speaking of big decisions, Australia went to the polls in 1919, and to Hughes' relief, the newly formed Nationalists actually edged out Labor 37 to 26. But if you've been following the series, you know that back then, Parliament had 75 seats, meaning Hughes' 37 was one short of majority. Instead, Hughes needed the support of the Country Party, who had picked up 11 seats. You see, the Country Party had argued that the needs of rural Australia weren't being advocated for by Labor or the Nationalists, and that Australia instead needed a rural pressure group. For context, the Country Party today is known as the Nationals, as they changed their name in 1975 to try and gain a broader appeal in urban seats. And unfortunately for Hughes, though they agreed to support his Nationalists and therefore enabled them to govern, he was distrusted by them for being too dictatorial and too unpredictable. For example, Hughes' treasurer, William Watt, was dispatched to London on a financial mission, and knowing how distrusted Hughes was within the coalition, Watt thought this was a ploy to put him out of the fold and keep him at bay. Hughes ordered him to do nothing without his approval. Needless to say, this really peeved off Watt.
Hey, wait for me!
Anakin, stay where you are. You'll be safe there.
But
Stay in that cockpit.
And he then went and resigned his post as treasurer. Despite being in minority, the Hughes government was able to make some key reforms. Firstly, the Northern Territory was allowed one representative in the lower house, a gesture to finally recognise Northern Territory as independent from New South Wales or South Australia. Secondly, the CSIRO was founded, more on this in later episodes. And then thirdly, Hughes negotiated with the then Anglo-Persian Oil Company, what we today call BP, to set up Commonwealth oil refineries. Essentially, this was an oil company that had joint ownership between BP and the Australian federal government. In 1922, they purchased an oil refinery in Newcastle and relocated equipment from there for use in its new refinery in Victoria. Hughes would take credit for this halving the price of oil and giving impetus to the rise of the Australian motor industry. He even went as far as saying the last war is a petrol war. At the same time, Hughes also pushed for renewal of the Anglo-Japanese Naval Alliance. If you watched last week, this might seem like a complete 180 based on how outspoken he was about the threat of Japan's growing presence in the Pacific. However, Japan signed the Five-Power Treaty with the US, UK, France and Italy. Essentially, this treaty required them to limit its navy to 60% of America and Britain's. However, this treaty was later known as part of the Unfair Treaties against Japan, and Australia was held in contempt for its support of this and for denying Japan's push for a racial equality clause after World War I. Though by 1921, Hughes had a stack of policy achievements to boast of, his political capital was at an all-time low. Hughes was a big supporter of tariffs to protect Australian industry, and it is important to remember that he started out in Labor, and so he saw domestic tariffs as a way of incentivising good treatment of workers. However, this really annoyed the Country Party, who wanted the removal of all domestic tariffs to easier sell their surpluses. Unfortunately for Hughes, whatever group he appealed to, he couldn't win. In 1920, a Royal Commission into Basic Wages revealed that New South Wales wages needed to be 40% higher to achieve a satisfactory standard of living. With this being unachievable, Hughes became widely discredited within the unions that he was once on such good terms with, but also at the same time, his tariffs had alienated employers. Against the odds, he had survived by the skin of his teeth in 1919, but now going into 1922, surely another win was simply a stretch too far. So Hughes was seen as tenacious and a little bit slippery, but now he was also starting to be viewed as corrupt. His public standing was particularly compromised when news broke that he'd received £25,000 from admirers of his defence of Australian interests at the Paris peace conferences. Imagine them seeing the state of lobbying right now. Speaking of corrupt consumerism, if you liked the video, please do hit that like button to show YouTube that Aussie history is worth giving airtime to. But Hughes was a pretty gutsy character who was willing to take big political gambles in a fairly unflinching manner, but I think it's fair to say that he was shaken by the backlash he'd received since the war. Because of this, he left his seat of Bendigo in Victoria to instead run from a safe Conservative seat in North Sydney. This was the second time he did this, having already left Western Sydney for Bendigo, and it wouldn't be his last. And so in December of 1922, Australia went to the polls, and for Hughes, it wasn't as bad as expected. Though the Nationalists lost 11 seats, Labor only picked up 3. With the help of the Country Party, Hughes had the numbers to lead the Nationalists yet again. But the Country Party wouldn't make it that simple. You see, Earl Page's Country Party had picked up 3 seats to give them 14 seats, and so Page was firm. He'd back the Nationalists on only one condition: Billy Hughes goes. His head was the price of their support. From December to February, Hughes refused, but after 3 months there was simply too much internal pressure within the Nationalists, and so Hughes relented and stepped down as leader, and in his wake, a guy called Stanley Bruce stepped up to leadership. And with Bruce now at the helm, it was time for him to negotiate the terms of the coalition with Page's Country Party. Ultimately, I think it's safe to say that Page walked away as the winner. The Country Party got 5 out of the 11 cabinet posts, including Treasurer. This is especially outstanding considering they received 10% of the nation's vote in comparison to the Nationalists' 35%. This was simply a deal too good to be true for the Country Party, and it ensured their continued loyalty to the Nationalists and their later rebrands as the UAP and the Liberal Party. The two also came up with a pact to not run candidates against each other's sitting members. But what about Labor? With Hughes being so distrusted across the nation, how come they didn't sweep the Nationalists away in 1922? Well, in the eyes of many, their opposition to conscription confirmed that they were traitors to freedom. Given that Lenin pulled Russia out of the war in 1918, Labor were conflated with the communists for not supporting conscription.
Hey, this guy's a commie!
Hey, keep it quiet! Where'd a nice little boy like you learn such a bad word like that, huh?
Commie, traitor to our country!
The communist slur isn't exactly a new play. Now, to be fair, the Russian Revolution did embolden some Labour leaders to express communist sympathies, and this then gave legitimacy to every attack from Hughes' nationalists. Not only that, but the Irish split had taken place during the war, and given that Labour had a huge Catholic presence, they were once again portrayed as enemies of the Commonwealth. It would take until October the 22nd, 1929 for Labour to finally get back in. If you know your history though, you'd know that just 2 days later, came Black Thursday, where the New York Stock Exchange crashed by a third of its value, which proved to be the beginning of the Great Depression. Thanks for watching. You don't want to miss next week as we see Stanley Bruce lead the coalition into a new era, but ultimately lose to James Scullin, who was faced with a test that no other Australian leader had faced in its 30-year history. Make sure to let me know below which clip art font you think I chose, and consider shouting us some Ovaltinis by supporting us on Patreon. We can't wait to see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.